Rome dazzled the world with marble, law, and empire, but beneath the polished surface lay customs so cruel, so normalized, that they read today like nightmares. For the Romans, death was a show, pain was a lesson, and the suffering of the powerless was woven into daily life. What we call horrific, they called tradition. This is not the story of emperors or conquests, but of what was considered ordinary, accepted, and applauded. Welcome to the dark heart of ancient Rome. The roar of the crowd could be heard long before stepping into the Colosseum. Tens of thousands gathered, not to watch a performance of theater or music, but to watch men tear one another apart until the sands ran red. Gladiatorial combat was not some rare event reserved for the powerful, it was entertainment for all. A boy could be taken by his father to watch a slave killed with a spear, and no one thought it unusual. Rome masked blood with the language of honor, calling these contests noble and heroic, but the truth was simpler. They were spectacles of death, choreographed to keep the masses fed with violence. Victors were celebrated like demigods, yet most gladiators were slaves who never chose the fight. Their lives were gambled in games where the crowd's thirst for death often determined their fate. When the emperor lifted his hand, a man might live. When he turned it, a man's throat would open to steel. Even women and children were sometimes forced into these battles, a grotesque widening of cruelty masked as tradition. Wild animals, lions, leopards, bears imported from Africa and Asia were starved and unleashed upon the condemned, their roars drowning beneath cheers of delight. In Rome, death became a form of theater, a ritual of state power, where cruelty was cloaked in marble and applause. What was extraordinary about the games is not how savage they were, but how ordinary. For centuries, this was family entertainment, a place where blood and laughter were poured into the same cup, consumed as casually as wine. To the Romans, this was normal. To us, it is unthinkable. The Roman household was built on the backs of slaves, and their suffering was not a secret but a matter of daily routine. To own another human being was not just acceptable but expected for anyone of status, and the cruelty inflicted upon them was dressed up as discipline, as management, as simple necessity. Slaves could be bought in markets as easily as livestock, their bodies inspected, their teeth and limbs handled like wares. Once inside the home, their existence depended entirely on the whim of their master. Beatings were not punishments for grave mistakes, but responses to spilled wine or a glance held too long. Branding, with hot iron pressed against the skin, was common to mark runaways or to humiliate the disobedient. In the countryside, the fate was worse. Slaves were forced into mines and quarries, where the air was poison, the light scarce, and the work endless. Those who descended rarely came back alive, their bodies discarded as tools worn out. In the city, the appearance of civility masked another kind of torment. Slaves who cooked feasts often ate only scraps, and women were pressed into service beyond the kitchen and bedchamber, their dignity stripped under the illusion of household order. The law did not recognize their pain. The courts treated them as property, without the smallest recognition of personhood. Even their deaths were seen as a financial loss, nothing more. If suspicion of a master's murder fell upon a household, Roman law demanded all the slaves of that house be executed, regardless of guilt. This could mean hundreds of lives ended in one sweep, a spectacle of fear meant to remind society of its hierarchy. Children born to slave mothers were condemned to the same fate, their future decided at birth, their names erased before they had been spoken. The cruelty was not whispered about, nor hidden. It was normalized, spoken of as order, as Rome's way of keeping its great machine running. For the masters, these were practices of necessity, as ordinary as collecting taxes or paving roads. For the enslaved, each day was a gamble of survival against hunger, lash, or despair. Rome did not pretend it was merciful. It pretended instead that this suffering was the natural order, that those in chains had been born to serve. And so the empire grew, its marble temples gleaming above streets built on broken bodies, while the cries of its slaves were swallowed into silence, as if cruelty itself had become a kind of civic duty. In Rome, the fate of a newborn was not sealed by the gods, but by the father's decision. At the moment of birth, A child was laid at his feet, and if he bent to lift the infant into his arms, the child was accepted into the household. If he turned away, the child was condemned. This practice, known as exposure, was not whispered about as shameful but treated as an ordinary act of family governance. A weak cry, a frail body, or simply the fact of being female could be reason enough for rejection. These infants were left on rubbish heaps, at crossroads, or outside the city walls, their tiny bodies vulnerable to cold, animals, and vultures. Neighbors passed by without interference, for to them this was not murder but the legal right of the paterfamilias, the father who ruled with absolute authority. Some infants were picked up by strangers, not out of compassion but profit. Girls especially were collected, raised into slavery, and sold as future servants or prostitutes. A child who might have been a daughter became a commodity, her life spared only to be exploited. Even those of noble birth were not entirely safe, for Roman law gave fathers the right to dispose of any child deemed unworthy. Physicians, philosophers, and lawmakers debated the practice not in moral terms but in practical ones, considering it a way to manage household resources or preserve lineage. The act of abandoning a newborn was thus dressed as necessity, a decision framed as logical, even virtuous, when cloaked in the language of Roman order. The cries of the discarded infants haunted the edges of the city, mingling with the voices of those who begged for bread, a chorus of lives Rome had decided were not worth keeping. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny bones in refuse pits and drains, silent evidence of what society erased from memory. The cruelest part was not the act itself but the indifference that surrounded it. The way mothers who wept were told this was custom, the way fathers who turned away were praised for discipline. Rome's greatness was built on rules that permitted such choices, rules that made cruelty indistinguishable from duty. For centuries, this practice was repeated in countless households, so common it barely merited mention in the records of the time. To the Romans, infanticide was a normal extension of family power. To us, it reveals the chilling truth of how an empire could rise to glory while quietly discarding its most fragile lives. Prisoners in Rome did not face justice as we would imagine it today, but a theater of pain designed to remind the empire who held power. To be captured by Roman soldiers meant your body had already been claimed as property of the state, and whatever followed was considered less punishment than spectacle. Crucifixion was the most infamous of these rituals, a death stretched out over hours, sometimes days, designed to break not just the victim, but the will of all who watched. Bodies were nailed or tied to wooden crosses and left to bake under the sun, the screams carrying into the distance as carrion birds circled above. Yet crucifixion was only one form of cruelty. Others were sewn into sacks with snakes or dogs and cast into rivers, their deaths both grotesque and symbolic, a way of erasing them from land and memory. Still others were thrown into the arena, unarmed, against wild beasts that had been starved to heighten their frenzy. Lions clawed men apart while the audience laughed, clapping as if the tearing of flesh were no different than a stage play. Public executions were timed to coincide with festivals, as if to fuse cruelty with celebration, death with ritual. Rome believed fear was the most effective tool of order, and so punishments were staged where the largest crowds could gather, ensuring that no one forgot who held authority. The condemned could include rebels, criminals, debtors, or even Christians accused of defying the gods. Some were burned alive as torches to light gardens at night, their agony transformed into illumination for imperial feasts. Others were forced to reenact myths in the arena, where the scripted death of a hero was carried out by real execution. The theater blurred until the suffering of the condemned became indistinguishable from entertainment. What strikes us today is not merely the brutality but the casualness with which it was treated. Parents brought children to watch these punishments, emperors attended as hosts, and common citizens considered it part of civic life. The screams of the condemned became the soundtrack of Rome's authority, woven into its festivals and its evenings of leisure. To the empire, these deaths were not cruelty but order, not horror but proof of Roman greatness. The prisoners became props, their agony a language of power spoken through blood, and for centuries the practice endured, until cruelty itself was no longer seen as extraordinary but as the foundation of Roman justice. In Rome, the banquet table was a stage where indulgence and danger mingled so closely that to dine was to gamble with one's life. Lavish feasts stretched for hours, with couches lined in velvet and dishes arriving in endless procession, roasted peacocks, honeyed dormice, and exotic fruits carried from across the empire. Wine flowed like water, spiced and mixed with herbs, poured in such excess that the floor itself often grew sticky with the remains. To be invited to such a feast was considered honor, yet beneath the glitter of silver platters lurked an invisible threat. Poison was the weapon of choice for those who sought to eliminate rivals quietly, without the clamor of swords or the scandal of open accusations. A sip of wine or a bite of meat could carry a slow death, striking after the feast ended, leaving the victim writhing in private chambers as suspicion fell on no one. For the Romans, poison was so common that it became a language of politics, a way to prune rivals while smiling across the table. Women of noble houses were often whispered about as skilled in such arts, accused of stirring powders into goblets or offering fruit laced with toxins, though men were no less guilty. Feasts became arenas of their own, where survival required as much cunning as appetite. Guests sometimes brought their own tasters, slaves forced to sample each dish before it passed their lips, though even this precaution failed when the poison was subtle, crafted to delay its effects. At the same time, the feasts themselves embodied another cruelty, for while senators gorged on rare delicacies, the poor of Rome begged in the streets, scraping crumbs from the gutters. The abundance of the elite existed alongside famine, a grotesque mirror of inequality. To vomit during a feast was not considered shameful but practical, for it made room for more. Some hosts even kept special feathers to help their guests purge, ensuring that the spectacle of excess could continue deep into the night. Death, indulgence, and spectacle became intertwined until the boundary between nourishment and destruction blurred. A poisoned feast might end with laughter echoing through halls as one guest collapsed, the others pretending not to notice until rumors spread the next day. In such a world, to eat was to risk, and to feast was to enter a game of shadows. Rome celebrated its banquets as proof of wealth and power, yet beneath every platter lay the reminder that loyalty was fragile, friendship fleeting, and that even the richest man could not be certain his final meal would not also be his execution. What Rome considered civility was in truth another mask for cruelty, another way death slipped quietly into daily life, as ordinary as wine poured into a cup. Roman medicine carried with it the same mixture of brilliance and brutality that marked the empire itself. While physicians could stitch wounds with remarkable skill or set broken bones with surprising precision, their practices were often rooted in beliefs that turned the body into a canvas of pain. Bloodletting was among the most common treatments, seen as a way to balance the humors of the body. Patients were cut open deliberately, their life draining into bowls, while the physician assured them that health would return once enough blood had been spilled. Leeches were applied to flesh to draw out what was thought to be sickness, leaving behind pale skin covered in marks. Beyond these rituals of bleeding, Roman medicine ventured into realms even more disturbing. Slaves and prisoners were used as living test subjects, their suffering considered a legitimate path to knowledge. Vivisection, the cutting open of the body while still alive, was not whispered of as cruelty, but recorded proudly by those who claimed it revealed the hidden workings of nature. For the condemned, there was no mercy, for their agony was masked as the advancement of science. Remedies themselves often blurred the line between medicine and superstition. Physicians prescribed concoctions made from crushed insects, animal dung, and even the ashes of burned organs. The blood of gladiators, still warm from the arena floor, was believed to cure epilepsy, and desperate families would rush to collect it as if life itself could be bottled from death. Women were fed strange brews to ease childbirth pains, mixtures that sometimes numbed them but more often poisoned them. The poor suffered doubly, for they lacked access to the skilled physicians of the elite and instead relied on wandering healers who offered charms, spells, or dangerous potions that promised relief but often delivered death. Surgery, when attempted, was done without anesthesia, Knives cut into flesh as screams filled the chamber, the only relief being the hope that unconsciousness might come before death. The tools of Roman physicians, hooks, scalpels, forceps, and drills were designed for efficiency, not compassion, and those who survived often bore scars that spoke louder than words. Yet in Rome, this was not considered extraordinary. It was the expected price of health, the ordinary ritual of healing wrapped in suffering. What is most chilling is not simply the methods but the acceptance, the way families offered their sick to such treatments with resignation rather than protest. Pain was seen as proof that the cure was working, and the line between healing and harm vanished. In the empire that prided itself on reason and progress, medicine became yet another place where cruelty wore the mask of necessity, and where the desperate clung to remedies that cost them as much as the sickness itself. In Rome, a woman was rarely seen as her own person, but as an extension of the men who claimed her, first her father, then her husband, and in some cases even her sons. The laws of the empire gave the paterfamilias, the male head of household, near total authority over the women under his roof. He could arrange marriages, dissolve them, and dictate every aspect of a daughter's future without her consent. Marriage itself was a transaction, sealed not with vows of love but with contracts of property. A woman was transferred like land or coin, her body folded into the lineage and honor of another family. Once bound to her husband, she was expected to endure his temper, his demands, and his judgment, for the law placed nearly all power in his hands. If she was accused of infidelity, real or imagined, he could cast her aside with little more than a declaration, and in earlier centuries even kill her without consequence. Her fidelity was prized not for its virtue but for its role in protecting a man's lineage, ensuring that children were truly his heirs. To fail in this duty, or merely to be suspected of failing, was to risk disgrace, exile, or death. Even her property was never truly hers. In many cases, whatever wealth she might inherit became part of her husband's estate, absorbed into his power. Women of noble houses were sometimes used as pawns in political games, traded in marriage alliances that tied great families together while leaving the women voiceless. For those in the lower classes, the burdens were different but no less cruel. Wives labored endlessly, managing households, raising children, and often working beside men in fields or shops, their contributions essential yet unrecognized. Roman writers themselves betrayed the casual cruelty of their culture, describing women as prone to weakness, deceit, or hysteria, justifying their subjugation as natural order. Punishment within the home was accepted practice. A husband striking his wife was no scandal but an ordinary act of discipline. The silence that surrounded such violence was its own form of imprisonment, leaving women with no place to seek redress. Yet despite the weight of these laws and customs, women endured, sometimes finding quiet ways to carve space for influence, managing estates when husbands were absent, shaping the fates of children, or whispering counsel that altered political decisions behind closed doors. But Rome never allowed them acknowledgement, never admitted their strength openly. To the empire, women were not citizens in the fullest sense, but shadows tethered to male authority, their lives measured in obedience, their bodies seen as vessels of lineage rather than as lives of their own. What is most striking is not only the scale of control but the normalization, the way cruelty was framed as law and silence as virtue. Rome built its glory on the illusion of order, and within that order women were bound, their voices dimmed until history nearly forgot them. The Romans transformed death into theater, turning execution into a spectacle that blurred the line between punishment and performance. Within the amphitheaters, blood was spilled not only by gladiators but by those condemned to die for crimes, rebellion, or the simple misfortune of being on the wrong side of power. These deaths were staged with the precision of plays, sometimes even reenacting myths where the victim played the role of a character whose fate was death, except the ending was not illusion but reality. Audiences cheered as men were set ablaze to mimic Hercules on his funeral pyre, or as prisoners were bound in chains to portray Prometheus torn by birds. Execution was not the shame of empire but its pride, a message carved into flesh that Rome ruled by fear. Crucifixions lined the roads, So travelers entering the city passed rows of broken bodies, a landscape of agony meant to remind all who entered of the empire's reach. In the arenas, beasts tore apart the condemned, their howls swallowed by applause. Children sat beside parents, watching as men screamed beneath claws and teeth, absorbing cruelty as if it were no different than a parade. What shocks us today is not only the violence but the joy with which it was consumed, for to Romans these deaths were entertainment, woven into festivals, birthdays, and holidays. Executions could last hours, sometimes days, carefully prolonged so the crowd remained fed on suffering. Even plays themselves could end in real killings, actors replaced by prisoners whose role was to die in place of fiction. Theater became truth, and truth became cruelty. The emperor presided as both host and judge, his gesture deciding whether mercy or death would close the performance. But mercy was rare, for the crowd hungered for finality, for blood spilled until the sand clotted dark. To die in the arena was not simply a punishment of the body but an erasure of dignity, a transformation of a human life into a story told through torment. The condemned were not granted silence. Their last moments were taken from them and handed to the mob. This fusion of cruelty and festivity lasted for centuries, its legacy stretching across the empire until even the smallest provinces built theaters where death could be watched as easily as comedy. Rome perfected the art of normalizing horror, weaving it into daily life so completely that no one questioned it. The empire saw itself reflected in the arena, disciplined, merciless, and eternal. And so, death became not only the ultimate punishment but the ultimate entertainment, applauded by those who believed themselves civilized while the screams of the dying were swallowed into history, disguised as tradition, remembered not as crimes but as spectacles of power. Beneath the marble arches and golden triumphs, Rome built its glory on shadows, on suffering so normalized that it vanished into the rhythm of daily life. What they applauded as tradition, we now shudder to name as cruelty, yet their world is not as distant as we wish to believe. Power still thrives on silence, on the ability to disguise horror as order. If these forgotten stories linger with you, do not let them fade into dust. Subscribe for more dark history, and join us as we uncover the voices the past tried to erase.